And hello, wary internet traveller. Welcome to the strange world with myself and the wonderful Troy Leavitts. I'm not sure how you came here or why you're here, but no matter. Pull up a chair, have a drink, and get comfortable. Because today we will be discussing video games and narrative. I am one of your hosts, formerly known as Q, now going by the name of NocFortuna, and I am joined by...
Hello, I'm Troy. I'm here back again with, I guess we're going with NocFortuna now, so right on.
Indeed, indeed. Want to do a bit more of an introduction to yourself, Troy, or do you think no need?
Well, if your listeners didn't catch it last time, so I've just been working in the game industry about 22 years now, and so right now I'm on sabbatical, but I'm probably getting back into the industry in very short order, and we'll be working on a AAA title that focuses a lot on narrative and characters and kind of, that sort of direction for game development. And so it seems appropriate that maybe we dive into that topic today.
And that is indeed what our discussion is going to be based around. Video games are relatively a new medium, and as a result, there are a lot of elements that could do with further refining, critical reflection, and indeed analysis, building upon established ideas at work, and through that, creating a unique medium. As Troy argued in the video called How Video Games Are the Highest Art Form, a somewhat tongue-in-cheek video, but nevertheless with some salient points, video games are a fascinating concept for us to take stories. But more often than not, a lot of video games narratives are lackluster and are usually defended as being good for video games. I personally believe this to be something of an insult because there have been many, many games which have done excellent stories, of which me and Troy will be discussing some of our favourites. But there are also inherent pitfalls which happen in this interactive medium, whether it be through player agency, the disconnect of depth, and of course the dreaded ludonarrative dissonance, a term that's fallen out of vogue, but which I will be defending in this discussion. So I thought it'd be very fun, Troy, if we discussed some of what we felt were good games that really merge narrative well and tell a good story that is either unique to this medium's strengths, or take a familiar story but tell it in such a compelling way that it would rival, say, a movie or literature or theatre or any other way we look at that. So do you want to start with some ones you picked, and then I'll go into some of mine?
Sure. So I'm going to sing the praises. I'll start out with one of my favorite narrative-driven games. I really enjoyed The Witcher 3, and I did not play Witcher 1 or Witcher 2. So I came into it almost entirely on the strength of reviews. And so I decided, well, I guess I better be educated on this. I wasn't sure if I was going to like it because it looked from the outside like it was going to be pretty standard fare, kind of a sword and sorcery sort of thing, and I knew nothing else about it. And to be honest, I think it took me probably about an hour or two, which is about my limit that I will spend with the game before I started to really find
same
it
here.
fascinating. Yeah. So there are good and bad things about The Witcher 3, but for me, one of the things I've noticed that I really enjoy in games, one of the things that I think makes a game compelling for me personally is when the world is so expansive and so fully realized that it allows me to feel like I'm really inhabiting it, that there's a lot of depth and detail both to the characters and to the environment. I've realized that's extremely important to me, as opposed to narratives where I feel like they're very shallow or very focused on just the character itself. I have to feel like there's a world out there to explore for me to get engaged.
Yeah, the coveted immersion, which is one of the reasons why I believe ludonarrative is actually a genuinely fair topic to discuss when we are discussing the video game medium. Unfortunately, it's a term that's fallen out of vogue somewhat, but please continue with your list, Troy.
Oh, well, I just wanted to say that if I'm, as a game developer, when I'm thinking about what makes a game compelling, as I said in my video that you alluded to earlier, is I feel that it's the player's choice. That allowing the player to feel like they have an impact on the outcome is really critical, and I think that's what makes our what would you call it, our genre, our type of entertainment.
Oh, I'd say medium, our medium.
Choice.
Our medium.
Yeah, our medium. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And so if the player doesn't make choices, then I start to feel like we're just playing an interactive movie, and I tend to lose interest in those sorts of games. Now, there are occasionally exceptions. BioShock is one that comes to mind that I liked BioShock a lot. even though I felt like my choices mattered very little. But in a way, it cleverly tied that into the storyline, but you had to get pretty far in the game before you realized that the reason your choices didn't matter was part of the narrative itself.
Indeed.
But in games like The Witcher 3, I felt like it was expansive enough, gave me enough opportunity to go out and explore these different avenues, and that my choices mattered just enough that it kept me engaged, and I just found myself engrossed in the narrative. And of course, it is based on an actual series of novels by a published author in Poland, and so all that background and richness and characters and kingdoms, and it was all pre-developed, and they were able to tap into that and make a very, in my opinion, very excellent and engaging game built around that narrative. So that's so I'm seeing the praises of Witcher 3 as one that I think has done it pretty well, and where I think the choices the player makes, for the most part, not in every case, but most of the missions end up feeling meaningful. If I made this choice versus that choice, I have a different outcome, which can then have a ripple effect and affect other characters down the line, and that makes me feel like what I do matters. Yeah,
you actually have a tangible effect on the game's progression and how it unfolds, which I think does play to the strengths of the interactive nature of video games, which is something that you're not just a spectator or somebody who is absorbing a story that's already been done and dusted. It's something that is unfolding before you in real time, of which you can influence in some way. I've not played The Witcher 3 myself. As I said, I've played, as I mentioned in the past, I played The Witcher 1. It didn't really grab me, and I've not returned to the franchise. But The Witcher 3 is one I hear come up immensely, time and time again. Not so much for its combat, which is being criticized quite heavily, but more for its just, as you said, engrossing gameplay and depth of characters, and the fact that you feel genuinely, immersed, to use that word again, in there. And that does seem to be the case. I think you had, was it 6 games on your list? You've already mentioned BioShock. What were the others?
So just ones that I've enjoyed along the way. So I also enjoyed Knights of the Old Republic and also Star Control 2. So these are old games, pretty old. I think Star Control 2 goes clear back, 92 or something? It's way back. So both of those games, I don't know that they stand the test of time particularly well, but they both felt at the time to be somewhat innovative. So first about Star Control 2, because it's the older of the two games. What I enjoyed about that, again, was the ability to make choices and this very rich, complex political world of aliens. And as you play through it and you learn about the different alien species, you can make some key choices that do have impacts on what happens with those alien races. Even though there's a general thread through it, it does feel like you've got enough freedom in the dialogue choices and in your active choices to impact the entire universe. Although the story arc, carries you through. But I remember enjoying that game so much when it first came out and being surprised by it again. I didn't know, what I was getting into. That I recorded the music tracks.
Yes, I remember. Yeah.
That I thought it was so cool that I could listen to the what was that called? It was MIDI tracks or something.
Yes, MIDI.
Yeah, so I enjoyed that one a lot, and again, I for the same reasons. And Knights of the Old Republic, that's probably the first game that at least I recall dove into what has now become fairly standard, where your choices start to accrue in the direction of either goodness or badness, right? And then Knights of the Old Republic also allowed you to unlock various skills, whether you went to the light or to the dark side. And so again, it felt like I had a meaningful impact in the outcome. And I believe, Mass Effect 3, or Mass Effect, the whole series, really built on that with their Renegade Paragon system. But your choices mattered, and it accrued over time, and so you kind of make choices based on that. So those are games that I really like. And then one more I wanted to mention. Again, I was surprised by it. All these games, I guess, maybe part of the element is I was impressed by it. Was I really enjoyed Vampire: The Masquerade, and when that one came out, I didn't know what to expect, but that game really sucked in terms of like combat, in terms of it had a lot of graphics. It was really graphics issues. It was buggy, but it still drew me into that vampire politics, and I ended up feeling like I was a meaningful character in this story, even though the storyline was kind of flat. It's also one of the first games, however, that I recall playing where your dialogue choices made a big impact in what you did and you could actually bypass various things through clever dialogue choices.
Yes.
You know, like you could make choices that would let you get around, and then you'd actually had skills that you developed that could impact the choices that you could make. You could, you know, have an intimidation skill or a persuasion skill or a seduction skill. And as you develop these, it would give you new dialogue options. And then because you had different vampire, what were they called at the time? Not classes, but they were the kindred. So these different lines that you had. And so it would make a different experience, a radically different experience, depending upon who you played, which was really fun and I think developed this ongoing community that still exists where they have continued to fix all the bugs that were in the original version. And that's one of those games where I felt like I just inhabited it as different vampires, you know, playing as the Nosferatu, which had to live in the sewers because nobody could see them, versus the Toreador, which you could get out and, you know, you're very pleasant to look with. So anyway, so those are the games that were on my list that personally I felt like they did narrative pretty well. They felt like there was a lot of depth and richness, and it felt like the choices I made matter, as opposed to other RPGs where, you know, I felt like they were either shallow or that the choices I made didn't really matter. And in fact, I'm gonna take a dig at Mass Effect as long as we're on this topic.
I was about to say, actually, I was actually going to say when you were talking about Mass Effect earlier, but I was thinking, no, I know his feelings on the Mass Effect series, so I'll let him finish. But I was going to argue that the first game was the only one that had sort of meaningful choices, and even then it was sort of a bit of a flip up in the air. But no, please continue.
Well, you're exactly on the right track. I've tried several times to get into Mass Effect, and I kind of feel like in narrative, especially in games, you have to have something interesting and exciting happen pretty early in the game, or at least for me, I'll lose interest. And in Mass Effect, I've never been able to get past the the Citadel. I've tried it several times because I've heard so many good things, and I always just kind of like burn out. It feels very standard to me, and I don't find it that fascinating. And so, but you know, I've got a lot of, like, my older son loves it, has a tattoo of N7. But then he was incredibly disappointed at the ending, and I think most people were, where it didn't matter in the end, all the choices that you made, and it all kind of just, you know, summed up into fate, and people hated that ending in that series. And so because I know that's where the series goes, I'm like, well, I don't, if my choices aren't ultimately going to matter, why do I want to play this thing? You know, it's just going to be 100 hours of invested time where it's not going to make any difference.
Absolutely no. And I mean, I must confess, I would never have played the Mass Effect games through because I tried to play the original one and was profoundly bored of it very quickly because not only could I guess where it was all going, but it just felt like an amalgamation of sci-fi I'd already seen. As somebody who's read a lot of, say, things like Philip K. Dick and Isaac Asimov and also things like Arthur Clarke and all of that. And also seeing things like the Alien franchise and Starship Troopers and Robert Hieland and all that stuff. It didn't really have anything that sort of gravitated to me and made me think, oh yes, this is amazing, this is original. And the gameplay was very ho-hum. But having said that, I did get through the third game. I did sort of stick with the first game because my dissertation needed me to play it because I was discussing moral systems. And I did actually enjoy it. The first game I did actually really enjoy. And I have to confess, there was a real turning point for me, which was about 3 a.m. in the morning. I was still playing this game. And I went into the... So spoilers, by the way. I think I should just preface this, that this conversation will probably be filled with spoilers. So if you've not played any of these games, I recommend that you do, of course. And a little disclaimer, no way me and Troy's list is going to be comprehensive. Of course they can't be, but this is just ones that are, you know, games that spoke to us and we're going to be discussing. But I can't remember where it was exactly, but it's where you come across, I think, Prothean ruins, and you meet Vigil. And there's this beautiful piece of soundtrack that's playing in the background. I think it's actually just called Vigil. And he's explaining the Reapers to you, and just the atmosphere of it. I don't know if because it was 3 a.m. in the morning and I was tired, but I was susceptible to it. But it really sort of created this wonderful aura and made me suddenly have a real vested interest in where this game was going. And then that's, of course, where it segues wonderfully into the climax. We had to defend the Citadel against, I think it's Seren is the rogue. Is the rogue? I can't remember what Garrett's creatures are called. Taurians, I think they're called. Taurians? Maybe I'm wrong.
So somebody will correct you, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm sure. But yeah, so in a way, that's kind of a bit of a thing with video games, is that they sometimes some of them really require a lot of investment on the player's side, and I think if the game doesn't deliver on that promise because of so much of your life has been put into it, and this is a criticism of books, incidentally, that when they don't, the payoff is so weak, you feel slighted, and I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of video game narratives do suffer. But there's some interesting games, some nice varied games. I'm surprised you nicely draw Republican there, because I remember playing that when it first came out on Xbox, and I bought it because I was a big Star Wars fan back in the day, not anymore. I checked out that shit long ago, that fandom long ago, and I recently played it again on PC because I got it in a humble bundle, and I remember the beginning sequence, the dialogue being really awkward because it was trying to merge discussing what you do mechanically in the game. And as a result, the sentences came across as very awkward because they were saying things like trying to bring in the gameplay elements but make it seem natural in the dialogue. Anyone who plays the game from the beginning will see what I mean. It's pretty evident.
Right.
But no, I think there's some excellent games to discuss. Here are my games that I've discussed, and again, a little bit of disclaimer. The reason these games are on this list is because these are games I've played recently, so they're still fresh in my memory. There are many other games I could cite, including things like Shadow of the Colossus, and there are some honorable mentions I can nod to, things like the System Shock games, Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver, the Paper Mario series, and all of that stuff. The reason I'm not discussing those games now is because I've either played them I played them years ago, and they might not hold up as well as I think they do. I haven't gone back and played them recently. It's like, oh yeah, no, this game really still holds up. But these games I have, all these games do enough in them, I think, that makes a strong case for why video games are such a exciting prospect for us. So, game number 1 is Devil May Cry 3. Bit of a strange one to put in there, but I'm going to explain why. Second one is Zelda the Majora's Mask. The third is... Oh, excuse me. The third is Project Zero 2, or as you people in the States know it, Fatal Frame 2. Number 4 is Mother 3, or Earthbound 3. I had to play that on emulation because Nintendo was stingy and didn't actually bother releasing it. 7 is a wonderful, wonderful RPG for the Super Nintendo. And incidentally, Troy, if you have an emulator, and if you don't, I could probably hook you up. I highly recommend you play this game because it is wonderful. It's got a great soundtrack, a beautiful immersive world, and characters you really feel strongly invested in. But it's a story that after you've been on such a long, powerful journey, the ending is so perfectly wrapped up and so poignant and really does stick with you and resonate with you. And that game is called Terranigma. It was a game only released in, I believe, the PAL regions and Japan, and never released in the States, so it's all the reverse of Earthbound. But it's a brilliant, brilliant game, and actually a fitting end to essentially what is an unofficial trilogy, starting with Soul Blazer, continuing Illusion of Gaia, or Illusion of... you guys know Illusion of Gaia, I know it's Illusion of Time.
So what platform did you say that was playable on?
Super Nintendo.
So it's pretty old.
It's a very old game, and yet funny enough though, it does a lot of innovative things. Number 6 is Demon Souls, and the reason for me is because you talked about, which is immersion, which is the ability of making every environment, every world feel like it's a tangible, real thing. You really feel like you're there. To me, with Demon Souls, the true crux, the true brilliance in that game is not the fact. I mean, the story is whatever. It's not a bad story by any stretch of the imagination, and all the characters are well formulated and intriguing and interesting. But it's each level has a genuine identity behind it, and it really feels like a tangible, real place. Everything in it works in the way you would expect it to work. Boletaria is organized and works as a castle battlement should. The swamps, the Valley of Defilement. Yes, I believe it's called the Valley of Defilement. It feels like a really oppressive, just a really oppressive, toxic place to be in. Latria feels like such a grim, but strangely beautiful, an oppressive environment to be in. Whereas there's a sort of romanticism behind the Shrine of Storms, and there's a really tight claustrophobia in Stonefang, which is the tunnels, and everything's just sort of interlinked together. Final Fantasy VI, which I maintain is the best Final Fantasy game. My personal favorite Final Fantasy game is 4, but from an objective standpoint, I've got to give the nod to 6. Number 8, I give to Silent Hill 4. And number 9, Chibi Robo. And finally, number 10. And this was a close call, actually, because I was debating between these two games, but in the end I went for this one. Because it feels a bit more complete, where the second game sadly didn't get the sequel it needed to have. And that game is Eternal Darkness. The other game, that would have been number 10 if I hadn't given it to Eternal Darkness, was a wonderful survival horror game called Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth. Unfortunately, as excellent as that game was, and as revolutionary as that game was in some respects, Sadly, it didn't get a sequel, and so as much as I think it's still a good story, and it's probably one of the best Lovecraftian told video games I can think of off the top of my head, it's sadly it feels somewhat incomplete and doesn't feel like it really hit all the strides it could have, and maybe the sequel could have expanded on, but oh well. So then, there's a lot there to unpack. Now then.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's interesting is neither of us mentioned the same game, right? We kind of came at this from different angles.
Indeed.
Which I think is really cool. And on your list, I think I've only played a little bit of 2 or 3 of those games.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I may not be able to speak to it, but I think that it's pretty good that maybe we can, through our discussion, extract some key elements that we like in narrative games and what the medium can do to be successful, or what we think it excels at.
Yes. Something I actually wanted to talk to you about in regards to this. Now, I know you've not really worked on big budget, heavy narrative games, sort of like your Uncharted and your Dark Souls and your any BioWare games, but one of the reasons I think that a lot of big budget games, a lot of mainstream games have such poor narratives, such lackluster narratives, and that does include The Last of Us, by the way, is because increasingly it seems that these people don't want to actually make games. They feel constricted by games. They instead want to make movies. The most salient point I can point, probably the most egregious example of this I can point to is, of course, David Cage. Who makes who started off making, I think, the quite underrated Omicron Nomad Soul, but also has made things like Heavy Rain and Beyond Two Souls and he made, I think it was called Indigo Prophecy Syndrome. I believe you guys know it as Fahrenheit Syndrome.
No, I've heard the Indigo Prophecy.
Okay, yeah. Oh no, maybe it's Fahrenheit. Yeah, I think no, it's actually my Fahrenheit. It's actually my Fahrenheit. Yeah, Fahrenheit in my country, it's Indigo in your country. And one of those sort of strange naming things. And it really strikes me that I probably know another example I can think of is I believe the company was called Redia at Dawn. They made the Order 1766, I think, for the PS4, and they were talking about how this was essentially more of a Hollywood movie, and that the gameplay was just something. Though they never explicitly said this, I don't believe so, but there seemed to be an undercurrent that the gameplay was something to just have to deal with. So let's just go for the most basic, most bland, inoffensive gameplay we can possibly shoehorn into this just to keep it going, just so we can tell this great story, which, if we're brutally honest, wouldn't hold up in any other medium. And to me, this is where I think that this idea of ludonarrative sort of enters its sort of why it's a salient point, which is the story and the gameplay should not be existing on separate planes. The two should be informing each other and interwoven. Games are by their nature something to be played, something to improve at, something to, explore in that interactive nature. You have to account for the agency of the player, and you have to also account for how the player is going to respond to things. Now, yes, this will inherently have some problems with it. For example, a cutscene might present your character as an improbable, all-powerful supreme badass, like, say, Devil May Cry does. But then when you actually play the game, you, having to now take over from, say, Dante, will get killed over and over again until you learn the mechanics. Now, the good game, for example, like, say, Devil May Cry 3, the cutscenes serve as a way to show you what Dante is capable of, and indeed the game's mechanics all play to that point. His ability to taunt, being graded on your stylish points, being graded on how flashily you can kill, and how well you can sort of balance and juggle between taking care of multiple enemies, dispatching them in the most stylish ways possible, and then also throwing in some cheeky little taunts at the same time. And that all sort of merges together. And then what you find is that the better and the more your mastery of this game increases, the more the Dante in the game begins to match the Dante in the cutscenes. And to me, that's one of the truly brilliant things about game, is that you as a player grow with the character. Now, in a bad example, and this is one I've talked to you about when I first discussed the narrative with you, which was, say, in the Uncharted games, which are quite criminal for this. In Uncharted 3, there's a sequence where Drake is moving through the desert. And he is on death's door. He's dehydrated, he's overheated, he stumbles down a well, he has like a tiny mouthful of, I believe, stale water, or stagnant water. And then he stumbles onto a camp where he meets lots of armed guards. And then immediately, despite a long cutscene showing Nathan Drake as this weak, fragile, on death's door individual who is in a very compromised state. The second that we lead the cutscene and we go into the gameplay, there is no noticeable difference on how he plays, how he interacts. And so what we have here is what this narrative has informed us is happening, suddenly being taken and cracked in half.
Right.
And it completely shatters immersion, and then it also takes away any sorts of connection you might feel with the character of Nathan Drake. There are other examples of this as well, but that's probably one of the most egregious examples. And I know I'm over talking. Please feel free to stop me and jump in whenever.
I think you hit on a really good point there, and it's something that I believe developers struggle with, which is sometimes sometimes your narrative collides with your gameplay, and it sounds like in this case, with the Nathan Drake example you just laid out, you've got one narrative storyline, and then it runs right into you've got this gameplay that doesn't match. And players recognize that. It feels jarring. It almost feels like you're playing two different things. That there's different elements going on. And from I'm going to try and talk from the developer standpoint. I think that this is a problem because as a player, you're trying to serve your player. They always want to feel like their choices matter and that they're in control of the character. And so, if you've got a case like the example you just gave out where your protagonist is in a bad state due to the narrative, that is not going to make for fun gameplay if you bring that into gameplay where you're going to make him also in a bad state, especially if it's for any extended period of time. Players will actually find that not fun, and they'll reject it if you're like, oh, well, you're taking away my abilities.
I disagree. I actually really disagree with that. I think that you could have made a truly memorable moment in that because you're now living Drake's experience. Because this is only one moment in what is otherwise, so what I'm trying to get is that the stark contrast would emphasize the state of vulnerability Drake's in, making him actually more relatable and more sympathetic, and this entire sequence would then be all the more memorable for it. But this would actually require competent game design. And I know I'm being a bit casual when I say that and almost a bit insulting, but I would like to preface I do actually make games myself in my spare time, as Troy can attest. But
I agree with you as long as it's, if it serves the narrative and it goes along, you can take some abilities away from the player, but you have to be careful with that because if you make it feel unfair to the player, like I didn't put myself in this position, like the narrative has required me to arrive in this position, and the gameplay itself feels cheap, or it feels like it's unfair. It feels like because it's perfect. I've had this in other games that we've developed where you'll put like a character in a cage, or you'll put him in an exhausted state or something, and then you have a sequence of gameplay which plays off of his different state. Then that's probably okay for a period of time. But you have to be really careful with that because if players feel like you've just taken away all the work I've done, or you've made me into a wimp and taken away abilities, quite often, at least in my experience with watching play tests and stuff, players will find that unappealing, that they won't find it fun. There is a certain element of power fantasy that goes on for most players where they want to feel like, especially if they've invested a lot of time, they've built their character up, and then if you rip that away for a narrative reason, a lot of times it feels cheap. You have to be very delicate with it. Now I agree that you can do it, but you've got to be careful. It's game design's got to be very right on the edge there if you're going to take abilities away from a player.
I don't deny that at all. I agree with that, but I think that separates the great designers from the poor designers, if I'm perfectly honest. Because here's the fact of the matter, as far as I see it. If you're not going to do anything with that narrative sequence, then, again, just use the Uncharted one, and there are other examples I can use of Ludo narrative with Uncharted, but this is one that's sort of stuck in my craw as I was playing it, which is, why is the sequence in the game at all, then? I'm not referring to the cutscene. You want to show Nathan Drake being harmed, that's fine. You already did it in Uncharted 2, where it starts off with him getting shot in the belly, and then he has to scale a train, which is silly, but I can sort of forgive that, because in that situation we see different animation, we see him being, we see him actually wounded, we see that the movement is actually quite sluggish, and then he collapses, and then it moves to a cutscene where he's found by, I believe it's a Sherpa, who then heals him, and then we sort of transition to him being healed, and then back at peak capacity. And there's no reason for them not to do that, but then instead they decide to have this action sequence. And again, that's fine, but then if it needs to be informed by what you've set up in your cutscene, if it's not informed by what you've set up in your cutscene, then it shouldn't be in there.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Is that it's that collision between a narrative sequence and the gameplay, and it jars the player. That's, I guess, that may be potentially worse. You probably than taking away abilities, whatever, because the players are going to say, "What the heck's going on? I don't even feel like I'm playing the same game," and the narrative doesn't match the gameplay.
Well, I sometimes think mechanical mix-up, as I like to call it, is indeed a good thing because it keeps the player on their toes and it keeps them interesting, and it also, at least again, games that do this really, really well, and I think of things like the Metroid games, I think of things like the Castlevania games, particularly Symphony of the Night, where you start off overpowerful, and then it will occasionally take these powers away from you to see if you've understood the core gameplay and that you're not simply spamming or abusing certain techniques. And as a result, it's teaching you to play. But I think one of the things you've touched upon there is something that's actually quite interesting now, particularly from your standpoint as a developer, which is a subject that's been getting more and more traction and become something of a pivotal conversation talking about this day, which is this idea of accessibility, which is all games must now be accessible to players. This is particularly salient with the Cuphead example, where most gamers and most games journalists show how willfully incompetent they were.
Right.
And now you had the likes of Jim Sterling crying about how all games need to be accessible, and people who chide games for demanding that players actually learn the game's mechanics and actually, embrace the game and see what the game's trying to teach them are somehow elitist and separatist. My stance is that both games can exist. I think there's nothing wrong with having a game accessible, but at the same time, there's also nothing wrong with having games that require you to actually, master mechanics and actually get good at them. To use the meme, get good.
Right, and I agree with that too. That there are different markets out there, and some people just want to have a difficult game, and then they feel the reward of it was hard, and I pushed through it, and I developed my skills, I got good at it, and that's rewarding to those players. And so I think it's perfectly good to have games that serve that particular market. I also think that well, it's a little bit tricky again because it depends on who your market is, and if you're targeting a more broad market.
Yes.
I think that it can be to the detriment of your game if you make certain tutorials or opening sequences that require you to prove a certain level of competency. That if the tutorial is just poorly constructed, or if players struggle with that, that's a different issue. Now, I'm not saying that Cuphead's tutorial was poorly constructed, because it was aiming very clearly from the outset. This is a difficult game that's designed to push your skills. So it's fine, it's great. But then sometimes you'll have other games, and I can't think of any right off the top of my head, but I've seen it where the tutorial is a chore, and it's hard to even understand what you're trying to get across for the player. So to me, there's a bit of a balancing act, and the best way I think to solve it is know your market. Who do you think is going to play your game? Who's going to enjoy this game? And then custom build the game around that and target your market very well. So Cuphead, I think, is doing fantastically. It sold 500,000 units in just a couple of weeks, so clearly they knew what they were doing.
I'm so delighted by that as well, because I really enjoy that game. I had to confess that, speaking of which, there's a rather funny video on YouTube, which I'll be sure to send you, and I'll also link it down below, of somebody doing a comparison video of the gentleman deemed, as it Takashi or whatever it is, trying to follow this basic command of jump and then press dash to a pigeon solving a basic puzzle to get Peanut, and the pigeon beats him. The pigeon beats him, which is hilarious to me. But I think we're getting slightly off topic, though. I think with narrative in gaming is that it's all well and good to sit here and talk about, reinforcing themes, setting themes up and then reinforcing them through gameplay, which is one of the reasons I see Devil May Cry 3 does that beautifully. It really has this wonderful build throughout the tower. It sets up the sort of conflict between Dante and his brother Virgil, and throughout the game, as you grow with Dante, the stakes keep getting raised and raised and raised and raised and raised. And then there's a wonderful moment where the two brothers actually unite to fight a final boss before, after coming together, they actually then go back to being rivals. And there's this wonderful fitting sequence at the end, which is you're sort of fighting over a waterfall on the edge between the human world and the demon world, which in itself is a excellent sort of visual representation of these two brothers, because of course they are themselves half human, half devil, or half demon. And the whole sequence is really tastefully done, and a very powerful ending to a very great game. And as a little aside, I think it's very funny that Ninja Theory, who did things like Heavenly Sword and also did the reboot of DMC, would often dismiss and indeed consider the original DMC to be lowbrow and holding the medium back. And yet, ironically enough, DMC3 did a much better job at telling a story about two brothers and their different ideologies than Team Ninja's try-hard Orwellian wubfest of dystopian themes and just an absolutely awful game with juvenile swearing and a fundamental misunderstanding. Basically something that would make even most Hollywood directors of the worst kind of grindhouse pulp cringe. Even B-grade stuff would look at this and go, this is crap. And yet, unfortunately, this is the stuff that's is becoming more and more expedient, and I think part of the reason is because it's just cheaper to make that way, and that's something that you're very sympathetic towards, as you've discussed numerous times, that this is a business. And right. Games are expensive.
Right, and to me, a lot of that is know your market. You'll get this happens a lot. I think we saw it in the Mass Effect Andromeda case, where it feels like they didn't understand their market fully, and what players were looking for, and then when they made their Andromeda game, it seems like there was a pretty heavy backlash. That it's like, this is not even a Mass Effect game to me. That you've missed the mark so badly. When they switch developers, that's always a risk that somebody takes. So I feel like knowing your market is a big part in understanding the tolerance that your audience will have for how much narrative allows for choice and how much do they want to be spoon-fed. A game that we haven't listed here, but I think a lot of people probably have enjoyed for some of its narrative bits is like the God of War series. Even though there's no role-playing aspect to it, but people find it in that same, ballpark as I would say like Dark Souls or, the challenge sort of thing. Mm-hmm. I just want to beat the boss and move on, but there is a narrative story that ties it together. But it's a different market too than these narrative-driven games that are more role-playing games.
God of War is a curious one because I would agree that the first one tells its story very competently. And again, I think I should stress that a story doesn't have to be complex or multifaceted to be a good story. As I mentioned, I love Final Fantasy IV. It's my personal favorite Final Fantasy game. But the story in that is incredibly simplistic. But it's told very well, and you feel very invested in the character's journey. So there's nothing wrong with simplism. That actually can be a great force behind the game. And indeed, such a simple narrative, such a simple framing of a narrative can allow for many interesting ideas to be explored. The problem with, I think, was God of War 2 and then 3... was it took away everything that made Kratos a tragic character. And the thing that Kratos was never meant to be, at least as I saw him originally, was that he was, and how he was set up in the first game, he was never inherently unlikable. He was somebody in a bad situation who had taken a deal, and as a result was sort of tortured. So he was this character who was in this sort of torn between these two elements, through his blood-curdling rage and trying to keep a vestige of humanity, which made him a compelling individual. This sort of strips away more and more and more in 2 and 3, and this is where I think there is the character just sort of metamorphosizes to somebody who's completely unlikable, and now in the 4th game, or the new game they're making, not the 4th one because that's called Ascension, they're trying to bring back basically the Last of War, or whatever, the God of War, Last of Us sort of clone thing. It looks shit, to be perfectly blunt with you. And there's another example, actually, of a game that was built on these interesting mechanics and concepts that were wholly unique to itself, well, to a degree. I mean, God of War is its own thing. Now being stripped away and becoming homogenized and creating something that is following an influential series that is incredibly subpar and mediocre in its own storytelling department. So
I'd like to ask you a question here. You've got a list of 10 games here, kind of like, I guess it's almost like your top 10 favorite narrative games. Do you see a common thread throughout all the games that you say, this, if I abstract it out, is what makes all these games appeal to me, or is it on a case-by-case basis?
Oh, no, it's very much a case-by-case basis. I mean, to me, it's with all these games, either they use the medium that they're in very, very well, so the mechanics inform the narrative and they sort of feed into each other, so they're not in separate entities. They're not separate entities.
So you do kind of have an abstract there that the narrative ties into the mechanics. You see a close relation in all the games that you've listed here as that's key. Is that fair?
I think, yeah, no, to an extent I would say that's fair, but because to me, if I want to just watch a movie, then I will watch a movie. If I want to read a book, I will read a book. If I want to play a game, I would like to play a game and then not have these moments of a poorly done, at best, TV movie where it grudgingly lets me play it.
Right.
Does that make sense, or did I?
Yes, yeah. I understand that it sounds to me like that there's this. It almost feels, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it feels that we have a similarity here where I've recognized for me that I want to feel like my choice matters, and so the games that I like, for the most part, allow me a lot of say in what I do and where I go and who I interact with. So that I can kind of explore at my leisure and spend more times on the things that I want, and as opposed to games that are very tightly narrative driven, where I feel like I'm following somebody else's storyline. Very, like I go from scripted sequence to scripted sequence, and my players' choices along the way don't really matter very much. I just kind of like play a gameplay sequence followed by a narrative cutscene followed by a gameplay sequence. Those games can be compelling, but for me personally, I find them less compelling than a game where I'm like, oh, I get to make a lot of choices and my choices matter.
Yeah, I think there's a difference. So, I mean, choice there is a word that, again, because for my dissertation, I studied sort of choice of player, mostly narrative choice. So when we're discussing choice, I think it's fair to point out to the listener, we're talking about sort of broad narrative choices, not necessarily the everyday choices you make, about shall I use the shotgun or shall I use the pistol? Shall I conserve this ammo? Shall I use this med pack now?
Yes.
Just throwing out there because, again, because games are always about choice, what move to use in the situation. That's one of the nice things about it, is that you are... Because here's something I don't see really happen a lot in games, is the acknowledgement of the player actually as somebody. There are a few games that do this quite well, actually. One of them was Deadly Premonition, where the protagonist, what's the main detective called? And it's gone from my head. But he actually talks to you, the player, and you're meant to be basically something, meant to be a vestige in his mind called Zack. There's a good twist with that, actually. I believe also the GameCube game Burton Kotus did something like this as well, where Callus speaks to you, the player, and all the other characters acknowledge that you are the player, are there. But it's not in some sort of fourth wall breaking dimension. You are basically just like a spirit that's following them and sort of overseeing them, and is sort of a guiding force with them. So you're in the journey, and you're a presence, but you're not a tangible character in the game itself, if that makes sense. That was really well done as well. That's another one I can recommend to you. And I think there is something that's something to explore there. But what you said there interesting about me, about sort of scripted events versus, organic gameplay and creating your own stories and situations through just the inherent strengths of the medium. Because I can actually think of a game that did this very, very well, and that was Breath of the Wild. So, story time, Troy. 2 stories.
Okay.
One of them was in Breath of the Wild. I'm stalking out a camp filled with these lizards. And suddenly it starts to rain, and I'm thinking, oh Christ, this is not good. I haven't got much ammo, I haven't got much weaponry with me, and they've got a chest. I want to go and I want to siege, and not siege, steal from them. It starts to rain. Suddenly, I can hear thunderbolts, and as I'm trying to as I'm trying to wonder how I'm going to take down this camp, suddenly I noticed that the hammer on my back is starting to spark, and that's when it struck me. And I was thinking to myself, I wonder, can I do this? So I throw the hammer among these lizards, and suddenly they go to investigate it, and then a bolt of lightning strikes down, hitting all of them. Because, of course, It's a metal attracts it. I then threw a bomb in there, took 2 of them out, then finished the rest off with a wooden club. And here was a scenario of the game's mechanics alone coming together and allowing me to tell a small story in itself. Now, if I'd been a Naughty Dog game, and I know I'm picking on Naughty Dog a lot at the moment, but to me they are one of the most influential developers right now in the industry, and I think that's bad because to me it holds the medium back. Shots fired.
Shots fired.
Shot fired. Gangster. And so here was an example of just the organic, to use that word again, organic gameplay coming together to create a scenario and create a sort of micro story, something that I could then share with people. That's unique to me, not something that you're going to find scripted, or not some scripted event that everyone's going to experience. It's something that is just perfect to me because of these natural mechanics coming together in the game to create a scenario that I took advantage of using my own quick wits. But the time that this really made me appreciate Breath of the Wild as a game was I got to Lake Hyrule, and I need to map the area out, so I found a tower. It started to rain. Now, the only weapons I had on my time was the bow, which was metal, and a sword, which was also metal. So I'm thinking to myself, no big deal, I'll just climb the tower, and go to the little platforms in between it and let my stamina regenerate. There's a problem, however. There are wizards which are now moving around the tower, firing bolts at me. So now this is my situation, Troy. It's pouring down with rain. I cannot fight back, and I now have to manage my stamina and get to these platforms while dodging all these projectiles in no scripted event except for the core mechanics of the game. It has to be me, the player, through Link, balancing all these different elements to get to the top. So a little micro game, a little micro narrative has began to form. And here I am. This is what we would call emergent narrative. And it was one of the tensest experiences I've had in gaming in a long, long time. I felt alive, to use that cliche. And, it was a truly wonderful moment. It helped as well that it started to rain outside my house when this was going on as well. So there's that real moment where the game and reality just seemed to come together. And it was this wonderful experience. And once I reached the top and I managed to escape out the area, as I was looking out over this beautiful landscape, I saw the Thunder Dragon coming along with that beautiful soundtrack, and I just sat there staring, and it hit me, this sort of well of emotion, and this sort of wonderful experience I had just, got through myself. Not because it was some overly scripted sequence, not because it was something that I'd experienced in the movie, and it felt so much more gratifying because it had been me, of a player, who had done it. And to me, that was one of the true strengths of video games, one of the truly amazing sequences in a video game that really, it's just like unlike anything else. As emotional as movies can get, as great as books can get, you're still only going to be a spectator. It's something that other characters are doing, and you're just passively observing it. And that's fine. You can still learn a lot, and it can still move you, but to actually experience that, to actually realize that you're, oh, God. I'm reminded of a wonderful quote, actually, and I'm sorry, I know I interrupted you, which was, one of my friends hates horror movies, but he loves horror video games. And I asked him why he is, and he goes, well, here's the thing. When you're watching a horror movie, the characters are have to do dumb things, and you're sitting there screaming things like, don't go upstairs, or don't
go in there, yeah.
Yeah. Whereas a good video game, like the Project Zero games, or as you guys know, the Fatal Frames, or Resident Evil games, you realize you have to go down that dark pit. You have to confront that monster. You have to try and get past, have to conserve your ammo, and you have to be the one that has to try to navigate this nightmare. And so the stakes feel much higher and much more tangible. And that's why he said that video games actually scare him, whereas movies don't.
Yeah, and I think, okay, so first of all, when you talked about Breath of the Wild, I've heard that from several other people, too, that they have these special moments, or these moments that they recall that were very impactful, that arose emergently from the game mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's like, it was so powerful because I felt like I was solving a puzzle that was put before me, but that wasn't scripted by designers, right?
Yeah.
It was something that I discovered on my own. And so it's a moment of oomph. It's a moment of recognition. It's like that mirror moment of looking in and saying, oh, I've recognized myself in the game and my own impact on the game. And to me, that's where video games have their greatest power, is when they make you feel like what you have done matters in a way that goes beyond what any designer out there ever thought of, right?
Mm-hmm.
Instead, it makes you feel very personal and invested in that environment. So, Breath of the Wild, I've heard that from so many different people that I haven't played it yet myself, but that
you need to,
I
Troy.
believe that it's a probably fantastic.
And I'm not a big fan of open world games, but Breath of the Wild, goddamn, it really made me a believer, honestly. And again, I think it's because it just let stories form naturally through the gameplay as opposed to crap like Assassin's Creed. And actually, Far Cry 3, I had quite a lot of fun with Far Cry 3 and Fallout 3 now that I think about it. But sorry, go ahead, Troy.
No, I guess I'm just enthusiastically agreeing with you that, and I feel like it's underscoring the notion that player choice here matters. And not necessarily narrative choice in this case, but it's mechanics choice about how to solve a certain issue based within the world. And that's what I agree. That's what I feel video games should be striving towards, is allowing the player's investment and involvement to be more and more meaningful so that everybody's experience through that particular game feels personalized. It feels like I was really there. I really did these things, rather than I was just following along with somebody else's idea of, what they thought I should have done, which always feels too constraining to me and doesn't really live up, in my opinion, to the pinnacle of where the medium could be.
But that, in a way, sort of segues something that we touched upon when we briefly discussed this last week, which was the realities of design and how expensive it is. And as I mentioned to you back then, I think one of the greatest tragedies of modern gaming is that because it's simply so costly and so expensive now to have to render these animations and these wonderful graphics that people absolutely demand, what is actually taking a massive hit is the mechanics and indeed the depth of the game. I think of games back in the day like Deus Ex and Half-Life and a myriad others where you would be able to, approach situations as you felt fit, die, learn, and keep learning and keep evolving with the games. Now there's almost a petrified fear by most publishers and developers about allowing any agency from the player. And what we're instead stuck with are, as I said, essentially sightseeing tours or roller coaster experiences. And some of this is understandable because why a great developer might run and be like, oh, I've got these great ideas for a branching narrative and multiple endings. And if you do this, it will influence this. And if you do this, it will influence this and have a knock-on effect and these ripple effects that are, widely spread. And then somebody like yourself, Troy, comes in and goes, yeah, that's great. However, budget.
Right. Budget's expensive.
Yeah.
And all that. Yeah. The more you do. So I want to ask you a question.
Go ahead.
And maybe this could be open to anybody else who's listening to the podcast through. So when you play a narrative-driven game, do you prefer to play a character that's pre-designed and that, has a speaking role, say like Nathan Drake or Geralt of Rivia or Dante in Devil May Cry, these are pre-designed, versus kind of the everyman figure where it does not necessarily have any speaking role, but you get to define who that character is, and a lot of that is in your own head, but then, there's no speaking role. And I'm also talking from a budgetary standpoint too, because if you have to record all the voice lines for an actor, that's a lot of money. If you don't, and they just pick, from a dialogue tree and you kind of imagine what you say in your mind, then that's less money. But is that more or less compelling to you personally as a player?
I think it really depends on the game I'm playing. I know it seems like a bit of a cop-out answer, but that's truly how I feel about it. I don't think I personally don't really care for voice acting in video games. To me, it doesn't really enhance things as much as it can, and actually I find it to be a detriment at times. One of my biggest complaints with Breath of the Wild was I felt at times the voice acting was very, very weak, and I felt scenes that should have been much more powerful were diminished, whereas I can think of scenes from, say, Majora's Mask or Twilight Princess which were far more impactful to me, and indeed Ocarina of Time, where the emotion was much better because I can myself imagine it. But I'm someone who reads a lot of books, and so as a result, I had to draw upon my imagination. I don't think games like Resident Evil, for example, Resident Evil 2, which is another one of my favorite games, one of my personal favorite games, despite its silly story, would be the same if I got to customize a character. I like Claire Redfield. I like Leon Kennedy. In the same way that I like, I like Kratos, and I like characters, or I liked Kratos. I love the original Dante, and I love Bayonetta and all of that. I think there's a lot to be said about creating a good character and letting me experience their story and their quest to grow stronger. And as I mentioned earlier on, I think you can use cutscenes effectively to really convey a point to the player of what they can strive to do so. Ninja Gaiden does this quite well as well. However, in games where the narrative is a bit looser, and I'm able to explore the world, and I'm able to make my own quest, either through the emergent gameplay I've mentioned, or where you want me to feel like I'm an intrinsical part of the world, then generally speaking, I like to have the flexibility to pick a character for myself. Usually I pick a female, usually I make her ridiculously sexy because, it's my world.
Well, if you're going to spend the next, 50 hours looking at somebody's backside, might as well be a pretty female backside.
Oh, right? Don't say that. Don't say that. Nils Sarkeesian will be in here screaming at us because we're objectifying those polygons, don't you know, Troy?
We might be, or maybe it's a trans woman. I don't know.
Oh, maybe.
I'm not objectifying that. Maybe I'm celebrating.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. But no, I mean, and I enjoy that. I mean, I put it down to me enjoying Red Sonja so much. But no, it's just the mood I'm in sometimes. I just like playing those experiences, and as I say, it really comes down to a case by case basis for me. So I would not like to play. So for example, a game like Demon's Souls, where the character is Demon's Souls or Dark Souls, where the character is just sort of it's a part of the game, but they're not the sole focus of the game. And that's the one with Dark Souls' greatest strengths, actually, is that your character is not the center of the universe, which is why not every single character bows in reverence to you. They have their own quests they go on. And Demon's Souls has this as well, to a degree. You have people like Lautrec and goodness, what other and Sator Bane, and I'm sorry, some of the other names just slipped from my mind. But your character has the potential to be the hero. But there's also understanding that because there are multiple other people online, that they can be the hero as well. And so the game treats you in that way. And so this is where I think a situation where being, having a tabula rasa for you to project yourself onto is a really great boon for the game. And it allows the story to carry itself through, you know, some relatively broad strokes just to sort of keep the narrative together. Most of the great storytelling can be told either through the environments or through the flavor text or through the NPCs, and then from that you can begin to build the world up, and then you can begin to sort of see how it all interconnects and how you can really enjoy, you know, really begin to get sucked into this world and really believe it's a tangible, real thing. And that to me is one of its great strengths. But in a game like, say, like I've mentioned on here, things like Silent Hill 4 and Project Zero, that would not work with created characters, because in both those games, one of the things that kept motivating me to keep playing was the relationships between the characters. In the case of Enemy Zero, it was the relationship between Mia and Maya, as they're trying to get out of the cursed village. And in Silent Hill 4, it's my sort of investment into Elise and Aline and Elena. Yeah, Elena and Harvey's it's about to call him Harry. And Harvey's story as they're trying to get through the cursed towers and solve the murders. That game has a lot of mechanical problems, but by God, it's got a fantastic story. Got a fucking fantastic story. A great antagonist. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, Troy. I rambled a lot there. My bad.
Well, I was just trying to abstract out some of my thoughts, because I realize that when I play games, most of the time I gravitate towards games where, you know, I get to customize my character, and it could be male or female, and that means that there is almost never any sort of, you know, prescripted narrative, and that you become just kind of this, you're peeping into the world through the eyes of the character you've created, but you rarely see your own character. You never hear your character voice. You're kind of an everyman, an empty vessel for whatever you want to project into it. I kind of like those games, but then I think, you know, what you just said made me realize that, you know, in some of the games that I've listed, like, for example, Witcher 3, I can't really imagine that working, where, Geralt, the character you play, is so crucial to the story and his relationships with the different characters. I can't imagine that playing out and being as compelling if I were an everyman. You know, I kind of feel like I have to be that key character in order for the relationships to matter. And, so I could see it going both ways. But from a development standpoint, it's generally less expensive not to voice your lead character, because everything that character says has to be voiced, whether the player sees it or not, right? Which is huge.
Yeah,
all those dialogue trees and everything it said, it can be, and I'm not exaggerating, you know, you could easily spend hundreds of thousands of dollars just in voice, you know, especially if you've got good actors. And
I believe it.
There's a real price there, yeah.
And this is one of the reasons why it always irked me when people were sitting there and screaming about Zelda games, going, it needs to have voice acting. Shut up. No, it doesn't. You know,
it's a trade-off. If you're spending money on voice, you're not spending it somewhere else.
But it's more than that, though, because what if the actor flubs it? And then why am I wasting all the money on a role that, as you pointed out, not everyone's going to hear and can be so easily messed with? And then what if the person doesn't? That's not how they imagine Zelda to sound, or not. It's not how they imagine Link to sound. Okay, I know Link doesn't actually speak, but I'm just using it as an example.
Yeah, Link is a special case because you do kind of you project into Link as though he represents you in the world, but you're right, he doesn't speak, right?
But he does have cues. He does have his grunts and his certain iconic sound effects he makes. Like it's hey-ya! And all of that, and from that you can begin to formulate what you think his voice might sound like, and that's what I've done. Again, the problem I have with voice acting is not that I don't understand that's not a great discipline, and I do understand that some games really do benefit greatly from it. But I'm sick of this idea that every game needs to have it, you know, and I'm also sick of this idea that it has to be put in there for me to enjoy the story. I guess.
Can I ask you another question? Have you played MMOs?
MMOs. Yes, I played the original. I played the following MMOs I played. I played a bit of Ultima Online back in the day. I played a bit of EverQuest 2. I played Guild Wars, which was the one I spent so many hours and it's not even funny. I tried playing Lord of the Rings Online. It was decent, but I stay away from MMOs now because it's just too much of a time sink for me. And also, of course, Warcraft. I played up to Wrath of the Lich King, which was really good, and then I just sort of checked out and haven't gone back since.
Yeah, that's an interesting, to me, kind of a case study, because I found that when I play MMOs, like Warcraft or whatever, I don't spend very much time paying any attention to the stories that those designers have put together. I'm just, okay, what do I got to collect? 12 bird wings, whatever. And I run, and I realize that they've often tried to create some compelling stories, but they're all text-based, or usually all text-based. And you come away from it like, I don't know. I'm just curious. Could you do narratives in an MMO game that are compelling, or is it just too chaotic and open worldy for that to even be feasible for a compelling narrative to exist? Or are you aware of any narratives in MMOs that you've experienced that you're like, oh, this particular story was so compelling to me that I thought it was amazing?
Yeah, I was going to say Guild Wars. I remember being really quite interested in that, and being really quite intrigued by the narrative and playing through it with my friend. But the problem with Guild Wars, and indeed a lot of these games, is because they're meant to be played for infinite in a way. They start feeling a bit repetitive and a bit grindy, and then because things don't really shake up enough, you feel like you're just going through the motions, and eventually my interest from it sort of detracts and just sort of leaves. And then, as interested as I was in the story, I think that's one of the limitations that it comes to, which is I feel. Sorry, let me start that again. I think it's possible to do it. But I think it requires a huge amount of money, and it also requires very, very good writing, which, as we've established, a lot of video games just don't have. And I think there's, I know we're running out of time, and maybe we can pick this up again in a follow-up episode, because there's still a lot to uncover here, and we haven't even begun to really scratch the surface of what I wanted to discuss. But,
oh, right, yeah.
Or indeed with you. If that's okay with you, Troy, of course.
Oh, of course, yeah, but I was just, so I played Guild Wars as well, and I also played, I played Dark Age of Camelot for quite a while. I enjoyed that one quite a bit. But my experience is that I never felt like I was playing those games for the narratives, right? I never felt like I was playing it because of the compelling characters or NPCs.
Yeah, no, and I can see that. Yeah, no, I can completely see that as well. Yeah, no, I fully get where you're coming from, and yes, I suppose in that context, I agree with you. I don't think it is doable, because so much of it is just padding. So much of the gameplay is just padding, and then you sort of get disconnected from the narrative because you're not actually you're not directly being involved in the narrative enough to feel like you're having an impact. It's just kind of going on in the background while you're doing this. So again, you're sort of kept separate, except for occasionally when it wants to bring you together. And then it's all undermined by the fact that, everyone else is doing the exact same quest, so the quest doesn't feel unique to you anymore. This was particularly salient to me when, I remember I'm misremembering this, but I believe in Guild Wars there's a situation where you need to go and find the ashes of the prince's wife, because she was found, and then you discover the ashes and she's been killed, and then you go back and report to the prince. But I was walking away from that mission, thinking to myself, now I'm playing a MOBA. And this has been played by, let's just, guesstimate at about 10,000 people. So 10,000 people have probably gone and told him the same thing. So why did he need me to tell him as well?
Right. It destroys that illusion of meaningfulness for you as a player, right?
Yeah, and I think that's an inherent limitation of the video game narrative and of the medium itself. Another one that comes up a lot is one that gets discussed is the disconnect of death. And I think some games have handled this very well. One of my favorite examples is actually that of Prince of Persia 1, the reboot by Ubisoft, which is every time there's a kerfuffle, every time you make a mistake and you die, the screen kind of washes out, and then the prince narrates and goes, "No, that's not how that went. Let me remember that." But the problem with that, you see, is that that the prince is narrating the story to you because you had these little moments where he's telling you the story, which suggests that he lives through everything, because how else is he going to tell you the story? So therefore, a lot of the stakes get undermined now, which is one of the reasons why I don't like first-person narratives in my books, because it suggests that somebody's already written it, which means that they've come through every adversity, which means it's hard to get invested and think like this might be the end of their tale.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, it does have that implication of, well, you couldn't have written this if you hadn't survived.
Yeah,
right?
But again, I think that's just more my hang-up. There are some really great first-person narrative stories, like The Great Gatsby, for example, or a lot of Lovecraft stuff. A lot of people might be wondering, because we're making sort of... I'm sort of going to get very angry at... Because obviously, at least in my case, I've thrown Naughty Dog under the bus a few times in this one. And the reason I'm going after Naughty Dog is because they are influential. And I think, as I said, I believe that while I have no problem with those games existing, and I think that there is plenty of room, as Troy has made this point time and time again, which is about the big tent. So would you like to reiterate that point, Troy?
Yeah, so I'm very much in that idea that there's enough room for everybody in all these different game genres. You just find what you like and you gravitate towards it. So I don't see it as necessarily exclusionary if, say, somebody wants to play a Nathan Drake style game where there's a tightly scripted narrative and even with the issues that we may personally have with it, if it does well in the marketplace, people are enjoying it, and it doesn't, hurt any of the other game genres, in my opinion. So I am just in this. My opinion is whatever sells, sells. Let the marketplace decide. Let's try different things. Let's grow. Let everybody experience different opportunities of what this fantastic medium permits us.
Now you see, I agree with most of that. However, you made a little bit of a slip up there. Oh yes. And indeed, I've mentioned it already because we've had two examples of games, of two game franchises which had their own unique gameplay, their own unique style, being taken away in the form of Devil May Cry and God of War, and being stripped away what made them unique in order to become clones of an influential game. So in the case of God of War, the fourth God of War game, I don't know if you've seen the trailer, not the fourth one. I don't know how many there are now, but the new one that's coming out. Have you seen the trailers for it?
I have not.
Do me a favor, go and watch the Last of Us trailer, then go and watch the new God of War trailer, and you'll be like, yeah, okay, I see what he's saying. And then, of course, the DMC.
Well, now I'm going to ask you, because I don't know these numbers, but so did those games when they changed what they were doing, what was it? Because Mass Effect Andromeda, it feels to me like they killed the Mass Effect franchise. It's in trouble now because they went in a new direction and tried stuff that players did not like. So I feel like, whoops, you made a mistake there in the marketplace, and the market is punishing you for that. What about these other ones that you gave examples for? Do you know if they did better or worse than?
I believe DMC did worse. God of War's not out yet, so I can't say for sure. And I would agree with you that market forces are going to be dictating of this. My complaint is that when we see a dominant influence, and again, that's not necessarily a black mark to the game that is the influence. A lot of people tend to bag on Gears of War because it brought in the cover-based shooting. Don't blame Gears of War for that. Blame every other developer from copying it but not expanding the mechanics in any meaningful way.
Right.
So, and again, I've got to throw a bone to Uncharted there. It's not Uncharted's fault, or indeed Uncharted's fault, or indeed Last of Us faults, or any of those games' fault. That games like Tomb Raider would have their entire identity stripped away and basically made a god-awful, Simon Says, horrible, terrible situation. Sorry, I didn't want to rag on Tomb Raider now, but I can't believe it did that to Lara Croft. I loved the original Lara Croft. She was such a great character. She was as confident, in control. She was somebody who was such an intrinsically feminine character. She had everything about her. Yes, sure, she was a vestige of the 90s, but my God, she felt like a original, unique breath of fresh air character. And then in the new game, they strip all that away and just make her this whiny, moany individual who's just acted upon and has no agency of her own. She doesn't do these badass things because she can do it, because she wants to prove she can do it. She does these badass things because she has to be a strong, powerful woman character by getting her ass handed to her time and time again. Ugh. God, I hate the new Tomb Raider game so bloody much. And the worst part is there's no reason to call it Tomb Raider. There was no reason to call it Tomb Raider at all. You could have said, to me, this suggests that you knew your game didn't have enough mechanically to stand on its own. So you said, what we're going to sell? I know, brand recognition, Lara Croft, Tomb Raider Origins, we'll sell it like that. And you've taken a perfectly good franchise and you've pissed on it. Same with Devil May Cry with DMC. You've pissed upon it purely and simply because you didn't have the guts to create something new with it. And the point I was trying to get to, sorry, before I went on a bit of a tangent there, which is a lot of people are probably going to get hung up on me sort of talking about games. And again, I'm not having a problem with things like Uncharted being successful. And if they're successful, they're successful. I know people who generally like these games because they don't see them as high art. They don't see them as Citizen Kane of gaming, as I believe somebody called The Last of Us, which is, by the way, incredibly stupid to have called it that because it just demonstrates a profound ignorance, not only of movies, but also of video games. That, and again, it's something that's born out of an insecurity, and I think a lot of gaming journalists have. But there's something I read to Troy from an old blog I wrote. I'd like to now read it to you verbatim before me and Troy wrap up because I'm aware of time.
Okay.
And that is this. Because I'm sure the last sentence probably pissed a few people off, allow me to expand. The reasons why story in games need to or should be compared to other mediums such as films and books is because stories are the binding aspects of which all creative works share. While there are certainly abstract and expressionist works, most creative works are meant to tell a story. Ever since our ancestors painted pictures on cave walls, we have always used every tool we have to create, document, recount, our traditions and our stories. Orally, visually, or written, we've always done it. Our stories, their structure, their makeup are always the same. I'm not just referring to Joseph Campbell's A Hero with a Thousand Faces. Beginning, middle, end, dialogue, character archetypes, and familiar tropes which exist within every medium are there because of studying and years of honing the craft. We love stories and legends, both as a means to pass on information or to inspire or to offer a cautionary tale. Having said that, most stories in video games are hopelessly mediocre, which just steal from better material without trying to improve or expand upon it, or use the uniqueness of the medium in order to present it in an interesting light. Hidden behind. And this is done with reckless abandonment and is always excused and hidden behind the term, well, it's good, for a video game, as if somehow that was any sort of excuse.
Yeah, and I very much agree with that, this for it's good as a video game is... That bothers me too. Every time I hear that, I'm like, no, as I said in my video on, the ultimate art form, which was a little tongue in cheek, but everything you can do in a novel or a movie, you should be able to do in a game, by taking away player agency. So it should only be in addition to, that's kind of my logic is that once I add player agency, I should be able to enhance that experience, at least theoretically, rather than detract from it. And I'm afraid that what you're pointing out are some flaws with our development, the industry in general, as we're trying to figure out how do we tell good narratives while the player still has enough agency to influence the outcome of that narrative. It's a tough problem to solve, but I also think that the rewards for solving it are tremendous, and we still remember these experiences, like your experience with Breath of the Wild, where you melded the mechanics of the game with a narrative that felt like it was uniquely yours. That, to me, is like kind of the pinnacle of what we should be seeking to achieve.
For most cases, yes. Just as a little aside, I don't think there's anything wrong with gameplay for the sake of gameplay. So don't think I'm saying that every game...
I don't think so either.
Don't think for a moment that me and Troy are advocating that every game now must be this, this sort of Dickensian tale or this sort of epic fantasy. No, we understand that there's nothing wrong with games like Tetris, and it's always fun to be had with things like Bejeweled and all of that. And they're just games for the sake of purely good skill-based gameplay. I love me some good old shmups. Like Ikaruga doesn't need a story. I just like the bullet hell aspect of that game. Or as
right.
So, nothing wrong with that. Don't worry. We're not trying to suggest that gameplay doesn't have a place. We think gameplay should inform narrative if you want to tell a story. But if you want to tell the story in your game, then your story should be good, and your story should be able to hold up or stand alongside other works in other mediums, and whether it be through films or whether it be through books or whether it be through theatre or anything at all. And I guess, to me, a lot of the reason we have this problem with a lot of narratives getting given the path, whether it be BioShock Infinite or The Last of Us or the Uncharted games or other games like Call of Duty and all of that, or Battlefield games is apparently having deep narratives, finger quotes, is because a lot of it is born through, as I've stated, an ignorance from the gaming press and people who try to analyze games, but also an insecurity, and also from, I think, developers and designers who feel slighted by Hollywood and feel slighted by other mediums, as if they're not taken seriously, and so they want to prove that they're just as good as those other mediums. But the problem is
what you said right there. I think is a key problem that we do see in games, is that the game designers, developers, writers will sometimes compare themselves with the Hollywood rather than taking full advantage of their medium. Not to get too off track, but I believe that's what Chris Roberts, the creator of the Wing Commander series, actually did. He did great with the cinematic side, but he actually came out and said, yeah, I don't want to really make games anyway. I want to make movies. And of course, he didn't do very well with his Wing Commander movies.
No.
And now he's come back into the thing. But, I think that you've touched on a very good point, that I think people who are making games should be in it because they want to make games, not because they're trying to make subpar movies and then shill them out as a game.
Yeah, again, it's sort of like this, I'm going to tell this great visionary tale, and then it turns out that they have to, it's confined to a game, and so they have to understand there has to be mechanics, and they have to think about how this world's going to work. And I think another thing, actually, what I think maybe touch upon in the second conversation, is about aesthetics and how those can inform the game, because, again, this goes back to the point of the narrative, but I find that when a game is trying to strive for realism, at times what could be described as quote-unquote video gamey elements might completely break that immersion, because you know how things function in reality, you know how real life works, and so when the game is trying to emulate that, but then it does something that's very video gamey and feels so out of place, it completely shatters that illusion. I think this is one of the reasons why I think that trying to do a one-to-one comparison to reality or constantly strive for those high-end graphics that are almost picturesque is essentially a pipe dream and a fool's errand, because again you are constraining yourself and you have to account for so many other variables, and so you have to leave to this very, very, the only way you could do it conceivably, at least within budget, would be to really constrain the player and take away any sense of agency of the player and make sure that everything is just so, tightened by the numbers. And for the majority of gamers, that's going to be, anathema to them. Most of them are going to just just give you the middle finger and walk away because you have taken away the aspects of what made this medium unique and interesting and unlike anything else. We're running out of... Sorry.
And you're just an interactive movie, or not even that. You might as well just be watching a movie.
Yeah, or doing one of those walk and talk games, And again,
right.
And there's nothing wrong with point and click adventure games. I mean, one of my favorite games that had a great narrative was the Blade Runner point and click adventure game. You played that, Troy?
I have not played the Blade Runner one, but I was a big fan of the LucasArts ones.
Oh yeah, Day of the Tentacle and Grim Fandango. Yeah.
Right. Monkey Island.
Yes. God, those were good.
But you played those for different reasons. You didn't play them for great narrative. You played them for the humor and the puzzle solving.
Yeah. No, I'd agree. I still think I think with Grim Fandango, it did tell some interesting. It taught some interesting concepts of storytelling. But no, since you're a big fan of narrative and branching narrative, depending on your choices, I would recommend the Blade Runner game for you. It's been a while since I've played it, but I remember being pleasantly surprised by it. And sadly, we are now out of time. Troy, thank you so much. I hope to have you again for our next episode.
I think we've got lots more to cover, so maybe we could pick this up again.
I think it'll have to be a part 2, maybe a part 3. My goodness, there's a lot more to uncover. I was going to do this big defense about ludonarrative. Unfortunately, I might have to do a redux video about why I think ludonarrative is actually a salient criticism point to keep and why it should be defended, because it does have merit. Or maybe that's something we can discuss later on. As always, I am going to once again thank Troy for his time and his patience and for putting up with me.
Well, thank you for having me. It's fun to talk to you. We cover a lot of ground, and it's very interesting.
Indeed. And I really, it's one of those, hopefully you, the person listening to this, has enjoyed this little discussion between myself and Troy. And I hope to see you next time. As always, be safe, be well, and as Troy would say,
game on.
Damn right. Take care, chaps.